Welcome to r/Maliciouscompliance, where you really shouldn't mess with the IT guy. Our next Reddit post is from Plasma Flare. I worked for a private company of 250 employees that deals with special needs individuals. So one day, my boss sent out an email to all staff and had an in-person company meeting because of something that I put on a state form. I'd written, "Client returned from day trip sunburned, disoriented, and dehydrated." The staff member with this client reported that the client passed out. Apparent heat exhaustion. We reported this case to the registered nurse and the state authority for possible neglect. So my report led to this emergency company meeting. My boss hands out a paper specifically telling each staff member that they're not to do anything outside the scope of their job description, and that we are not doctors. And this entire time, she was staring directly at me. She calls me out specifically during the meeting by name. All right, fine. I'll stop doing anything but the exact wording of my original hiring duties. 2 months later, I get a call about a problem with the computers at the main office. I had traditionally done all the IT troubleshooting, as I was one of the first hires of the company, and I had a background for it. My boss calls me on my day off and asks me to drive to the main office, 1 hour away, to fix their computer system. I said to her, "I can't do anything outside of my listed duties, as per your order." Then I hang up and turn off the phone until dinner. After I turned the phone back on, I got a call within 10 minutes from the company owner. The owner, who had been nothing but nice to me up until now, just bluntly asks me, "So, do you feel like doing your job now and getting things working? Especially payroll. Don't you want to get paid tomorrow? Get your ass in gear, son." That may have been the wrong way to start the conversation with someone who was not being paid extra for their IT problems. I referred the owner to the rule that my boss put in place, and I also pointed out that the company had a no firearms rule, but the owner liked to walk around with a pistol strapped to his hip. I then politely advised him to find a way to deal with his own problems, as the computers being bricked wasn't my problem. Then I turned my phone off again, and I was at work 2 days later. During that time, apparently 3 staff had quit from failing to be paid. 18 more staff was threatening to quit, and the owner had driven over to have a chat with my boss and myself. The owner and the boss explained to me that as a senior care staff, my job role had expanded over the years that I was there. 5 years at that point. And I countered that my pay hadn't expanded at all since the day I'd been hired. Me doing IT work was a charity from me, not a job requirement. And I didn't appreciate any of the disrespect that I'd gotten lately from either of them. I also pointed out that I knew full well that a contract IT company would cost them at least hundreds, if not thousands of dollars for a consultation, and at least $200 an hour. And if I deigned to fix their problem, it would take about 3 hours. The owner offered me a 50-cent raise and 3 hours of overtime. I countered with a request for a public apology in front of all staff from the boss, a $3 an hour raise, and an exemption from the no-carry firearm policy that my boss was being hypocritical about. They said no, so I said, "Okay, good luck with that." Keep in mind that all the computer systems were effectively bricked at this point. So the nurses can't communicate with each other, no one can bill time for casework, and no one can send out any paperwork. It took them 4 more days and 8 more employees quitting to get them to agree to my conditions. And that was after 4 attempts to get me to let go of the concealed carry requirement. That was their sticking point. I don't carry a gun at work, and I never have, even though in my state it's totally legal. But what bugged me was the absolute hypocrisy of the owner. So I would have given up the raise before that. In the end, it turns out that the owner's wife deleted something that she shouldn't have had access to, and it took me about 8 minutes to restore the files from backups that I personally had on an old hard drive. Well, I guess they never learned the lesson. Don't mess with the IT guy. Our next Reddit post is from Kate. The bar owner said that patrons only want the jukebox, so I complied. I went to a local bar today to watch the College World Series final. The bartender said that they can't play the sounds for the game because more patrons want to play the jukebox than watch the game. There's about 12 people in the bar total, including my party of 4. This seems silly, considering it's a sports bar and there aren't any other major sporting events occurring at the same time. I decide that since the patrons want the jukebox is what they'll get. I queue up Cotton Eye Joe 6 times in a row, and I pay the extra to bump it to the front of the queue. After the first playthrough, the jukebox skips to a different song. We call the manager over and ask him to refund our jukebox money since he won't play our song. And he says that he would rather refund our money than have to listen to Cotton Eye Joe 6 times in a row. So he comes back a few minutes later, hands over the $13 to cover the songs, and turns on the sounds for the baseball game. Turns out his patrons didn't want to listen to the jukebox that badly after all. Our next Reddit post is from Story Skeller. This story happened in 2017, and it was repeated every year until this year, and I've promised my father-in-law to repeat the compliance if it happens again. My in-laws used to live just outside of town. And when I say just outside the city, I mean about 2 meters outside of the city plan. To be exact, the city plan reaches up to the middle of the dirt road that separates their property from the neighboring one. So back in spring of 2017, my in-laws received a letter from the city council about clearing their property from dead grass in preparation for summer due to fire hazards, or they would be fined. The letter and the deadline they gave us were normal. What wasn't normal was the area named. The area the letter said that my parents had to clean wasn't their property. It was the property next to them, inside the city limits, and the road in between these two properties. My father-in-law took the letter to the council and explained that the property next to him didn't belong to him and he couldn't clean it. They appeared to accept it, but something was nagging my father-in-law. Now, my father-in-law had worked in exactly 2 companies before. Both of them handled big government contracts, and his main job was to take care of the red tape and government bureaucracy. So my father-in-law found the exact laws that were relevant to his situation. He also found, through his connections, that the local council was under investigation for misappropriation of funds, including the funds for cleaning lots that were considered fire hazards. The tactic they used was to force neighbors to clean lots that weren't their responsibility and intimidate them with the threat of a fine and then pocket the money. My father-in-law decided to become creative. First, he gathered all the plans related to his property and the one next to him. Next, he cleared his property. He was planning on doing that anyways, but he only cleaned his property. But not only that, he also cleared the part of the road that fell outside the city limits. Then he waited. The deadline passed about 10 minutes later, and a hefty fine arrived. My father-in-law officially challenged the fine. The council tried to enforce the fine. My father-in-law challenged it again, presenting his evidence on an open forum of the council. The council insisted that they were right and that if my father-in-law didn't pay, they would take legal action. My father-in-law happily agreed to take legal action. This led to the court appointing an outside inspector to check the property, the city plans, and the work my father-in-law had done. The council not only lost the case and had to pay legal fees, but were forced to an outside audit that led to a couple of councilmen facing criminal charges. Every year since then, my father-in-law used to clean his property and exactly up to the middle of the road next to him. That duty has been passed down to me now, which I fulfilled this year. You know, you'd think that if council members are engaging in illegal activities and then one of their constituents decides to take them to court, that would be their cue to just stop trying to scam that particular resident and move on, but I guess some people are just greedy. Our next Reddit post is from Larnie Barney. To preface this story, I'm allergic to beans. When I was a tot, my mom tried to feed me beans a few times, and within 5 minutes, I would projectile vomit right across the kitchen floor. She put 2 and 2 together, and after that, no more beans for me. So jump forward a few years. I was about 7 years old visiting my grandparents for winter break. I loved hanging out with my grandfather. He'd always bring me neat things like books and logic puzzles for us to play through together. That day in particular, he had bought me new crushed velvet pajamas covered in stars and comets. I was super excited to wear them to bed, and I was already wearing them at the table when everything went down. Dinner time rolls around, and my grandfather reveals that he made slow-roasted beans for us. I immediately tell him and my grandmother that I don't eat beans because they make me sick. My grandfather rolled his eyes and told me to sit and eat my dinner. Now, to be fair, I was a bit of a picky eater, but I would never claim that the food I disliked would make me sick. I would just say that I didn't like that dish. Beans were the only thing that I'd explicitly say made me sick. I repeat again that I don't eat beans, that my mom never makes me eat them, and that they make me sick. My grandfather starts getting mad and tells me that either I sit at the table until I finish all the beans that I'd been served, or I can go straight to bed and expect to be put on restriction for the next few days. My grandmother tells him that he should just leave me be, but he isn't having it. This was the only time that I've ever felt anything other than pure, wholesome love for my grandpa. He and my grandmother finished their dinner and started to clean up while I thought about what I should do. On the one hand, I could just go to bed and accept that I'd probably have no cartoon time for the next couple of days. But I was so mad that he didn't believe me that I refused to accept being punished for telling the truth. So I sat there and ate the entire effing bowl of beans. I'm now 24 years old, and that singular bowl of beans probably represents at least 80% of the beans that I've ever consumed in my life. I hated the texture, the smell, absolutely everything about what I was eating. But Grandpa said to eat them all, so that's exactly what I was gonna do. About halfway through, I start feeling strange, but I push through it. I swallowed the beans whole and washed them down with as much milk and cornbread as possible. All in all, it probably took me like 15 or so minutes to finish, but it felt like hours. I finish up, put my bowl in the sink, and softly announce that I'm done with all my food. I remember my grandpa patted me on the back and said, "See, it wasn't that bad, was it?" as we walked down the hall towards the bedrooms. At the very end of the hall was the doorway to the master bedroom, with a bathroom directly across from the hall. My grandpa told me to brush my teeth while he changed into his pajamas and that he would come to my room afterwards to tuck me in. I open my mouth to say, okay, and all of a sudden, my alarm bells go off. I turn around so that I'm facing the bathroom, try to take a few steps to at least make it to the sink, fail, and then proceed to projectile vomit all over the floor, the vanity, the mirror, and myself. Chunks of beans and cornbread collected at my feet as I coughed up everything that I'd swallowed whole. The milk mixed with the beans in the most horrific way possible, making the vomit thicker and stickier. My new pajamas were absolutely ruined, and the smell only made me vomit even more. I started to cry as I stood in a pool of the vilest mixture of fluids that I'd ever seen come out of my body. It was so sudden and violent that my grandparents couldn't even react right away. My grandmother scooped me up and started consoling me. I peeped at my grandfather, who was still standing there horrified at what he had just seen. And I stammered, "I told you beans made me sick," in the most defeated voice I could muster. My grandmother gave him a death glare and told him curtly that since he had pushed me to eat the beans, he could clean them up. My grandma helped me shower in the bathroom and calm down until I asked her about my pajamas. My stomach bile basically ruined them, and she told me that we should just throw them away. I cried even harder. When she finally got me to lay down and go to sleep an hour later, my grandfather was still purging the bathroom. The next morning, my grandfather apologized to me profusely and promised he would never do anything like that again. As far as I know, not only did he never again force me to eat anything that I said that I didn't want, but he extended the same policy to the rest of his grandkids. Years later, he would say that he could still remember the stench of the bathroom that night and the disgusting sensation of scooping semi-solid beans from every imaginable surface. Our next Reddit post is from Apprehensive Lurker. I'm a 33-year-old woman, and I unexpectedly gave birth 2 months earlier than my due date. Thankfully, baby and I are doing great, and we've now made it home. As you can imagine, the baby coming that early meant that we had to have a rather long stay in the Nicu. Now that we're home and I've been able to process everything, I wanted to share a moment of malicious compliance that helped bring some levity to a really scary experience. One of the most important things for a baby, especially preemies, is skin-to-skin time, which is where mothers or fathers will be either topless or open their shirts to cuddle their infants. Our baby struggled with jaundice, so our skin-to-skin time was very limited at first because of light therapy. We had been moved to a new location in the NICU right next to another baby and across from 2 others. A standard of care in the NICU is monitoring the baby's breathing, heart rate, and oxygen levels. Those monitors look like an old-school tube TV and are approximately 16 inches by 16 inches, and they can display babies in other areas as well if the nurses need to. So I'm getting ready to set up the hospital-provided screen so I can get in my skin-to-skin time with my baby, but I realize that I may end up blocking the view to the monitor for the nurses. I ask the nurse if I'm blocking the monitor, and she tells me everything's fine. Not even 10 minutes later, I feel someone in my space, and I look up to see a woman glaring down at me. Once I've made eye contact, Karen starts in on me. While I'm topless, by the way, and holding a premature baby, so very vulnerable. She starts chewing me out that I'm blocking the nurse from caring for her baby. When I try to explain that I asked before setting things up, she refuses to listen and continues to lecture and gets more aggressive and angry, saying that I'm causing her baby not to receive appropriate care and I'm pushing her out of the care area. After all the emotional stress and frustration of being in the hospital, I finally snapped, looked at the nurse, and told her to take away the screen. The nurse was horrified and started saying, "But your privacy." To which I replied, "It would seem that my privacy and modesty don't matter as much as Karen's comfort, so get rid of the screen." This pissed off Karen even more because she realized that she would have to spend the next hour staring at me topless. She got very annoyed and uncomfortable, especially whenever a doctor walked by, got flustered, and tried to insist that I get a new screen. I may have been the butthole, but I was simply done. So I just stared right back and said, "According to my neighbor here, my privacy doesn't matter, so we all get to be uncomfortable." When I tell you if looks could kill, I'd be dead, I am not joking. The doctors didn't want to deal with it, and the nurses who did have to deal with it were laughing at the situation. They then brought the screen back out and tried to show Karen that they can still totally see all the baby's stats on the monitor, so there was no reason for this outburst. I wish I could say that this was the last time Karen freaked out about this, but she pulled this same kind of stunt almost every time I tried to snuggle my baby, until her baby was finally discharged a week later. But seeing the look of shock on her face when I just forced everyone to look at my boobs is probably going to make me giggle every time I think about it. That was rSlash Maliciouscompliance, and if you like this content, check out my podcast where I publish the exact same episodes. Also, hit that subscribe button because I put out new Reddit videos every single day.